Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Our next speaker is Professor David Suggett from KAUST Reefscape Restoration Initiative, and he will be talking to us about harnessing the potential for robotics and automation for restoring coral reefs. Please welcome Professor David Suggett.
Thank you, everyone. And I wanted to say thanks to the organizing committee as well. It's been a fascinating meeting already. This is well outside of my wheelhouse, so it's been an incredibly instructive, informative meeting already. And what you're going to get from me is really the brief I was provided as a really one-on-one on reef restoration and where the opportunities lie for robotics and automation. So I'm really going to drop a bit of a problem bomb on you, and I'm hoping that we'll come up with some solutions over the course of the next few days. But as I said, we're primed to make use of the opportunity as I'll run through, and I'll try and stick to time as best as possible. So as many of you know, and I won't dwell too much on this, we're at a huge historical turning point for ecosystem management, not just for coral reefs, but for ecosystems globally. And we really are running out of time if we want to keep visualizing reefs in the way in which we're used to. And this is one example of some of the reefs in the Northern Red Sea. They are spectacular. They can be spectacular, but we are simply running out of, we have an ever declining window of opportunity to retain these sorts of systems. And for coral reefs, but other coastal systems, and you heard in Matt McCabe's really insightful talk, mangroves, also seagrass systems all around the coasts in the Red Sea and elsewhere, we really need to take global action very, very quickly on climate. The problem we have, and the problem at which to why we are accelerating within the restoration space, is that our climate trajectories are simply uncertain, whether it be in terms of policy and emissions. We can come up with multiple scenarios, and we know that the future is extremely poor under current climate emissions, but we simply, despite best efforts, do not know where we will be in the next 10 years' time. And so what this has meant for many local communities and small communities is that we have to take action now. We cannot wait for the next 10 years of aspiring to our climate emissions. We need to be able to retain the ecosystems we have, and we have to rebuild the systems we have in real time. And these are three examples, as you can see here on the screen. The left-hand side is Indonesia, the top right is on the Great Barrier Reef, and the bottom right is Fiji. And all of these are examples of low-scale community efforts that have been introduced in the past 5 years to take action and replant and regrow coral at ever-increasing scales that have been possible before. And that is one of the challenges that you'll find as we go through this presentation, is meeting that grand challenge of scale. Here are some examples of the outputs of some of those efforts. On the right-hand side, this is really some of the reef recovery, the targeted reef recovery that we've experienced on the Great Barrier Reef and some of the highly degraded areas. The bottom right is an example from Indonesia, where entire rubble fields have been reclaimed through augmented structures and replanting. And the left-hand side is the Caribbean, where restoration efforts are now bringing back some of the branching coral species from the brink of extinction. So we can show it's possible. We can show it's possible at small scale. But really what we will need to do is a step change in thinking to really break that scale ceiling, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. This is an example here. There's not an awful lot of data in this presentation. This is one paper that we produced a few years ago, and it's really to demonstrate not only that historically there have been a lot of small scale activities in the reef restoration space, but as you can see in the left-hand panel to the left-hand side, there's a huge amount of acceleration in this particular field. And this really primes us for the opportunity. Coupled to that, this is a really interesting and important report that we have. We're just building on this at the moment. This examples the investment space to reef restoration to date, and it currently stands at about $250,000 up until 2021, over the past 10 years, up until 2021. Beyond 2021, we're seeing an acceleration in the funding space, and I'll close the presentation really in where we're at in that and where the opportunity for robotics and automation really lies in terms of being able to resource that. And really it's being able to resource that, as I said, that's needed to break the scale ceiling. And as you heard from Dr. Moram's presentation yesterday from our KAUST Reefscape Restoration team, we have an ambitious project that is underway at Shisha Island. I'm not going to repeat that presentation for those of you that were there yesterday. If you missed it yesterday, you can see some of this information online. Shisha Island is positioned in the northern Red Sea in the Neom region. And as you can see in the bottom right-hand image there, we've now mapped the entire reefscape space. And that's been really important for lots and lots of reasons. Each of those little quadrants is nested in a hectare. It's a 100-hectare site. It is the largest single restoration footprint in the world that's been attempted. The little white square that you can see in that bottom right-hand side is the typical size of other restoration projects around the world. So that gives you an idea of the difference in scale. We're basically operating at 2 orders of magnitude to be able to regenerate and retain the quality of this site. So of course we have to retune the approach. Unfortunately, Matt McCabe's fantastic presentation before coffee did a brilliant job of really summarizing where the agricultural and terrestrial fields are in this space in terms of robotics and automation. And I've just summarized a couple of the particular approaches that we've seen have been innovative, certainly in the terrestrial space, recently using vehicles to be able to automate at scale in terms of reseeding and replanting material in terrestrial and coastal systems. So it's really leveraging that way of thinking, turning towards a more industrialized and at scale approach that we critically need. Where we stand a huge challenge with corals and coral reefs is there's an exceptionally complex life cycle. Now, we think about restoring terrestrial systems, we can use seeds or we can use established plants. There's pros and cons to both. Within reef systems, there's typically also pros and cons depending on where you hit the life cycle. You typically work in the top left-hand side. You work with, these are actually replanted coral that had started off with tiny fragments on the Great Barrier Reef. So we typically fragment their clonal organisms. So you basically break them apart and all of the cell lines continue to grow on the reef quite happily. And corals are designed to do that. They break, they recover naturally themselves. And we exploit that asexual reproduction process as part of the restoration activity. But corals also sexually reproduce. Typically once per year, corals will undergo a mass spawn and they will produce new eggs and sperm. They'll recombine, and this gives us a new opportunity to genetically recombine the whole of that landscape within the reef. And that's a really, really important part of the process. And so restoration similarly needs to exploit that. The bottom right-hand side is just a little figure of the about 7 days or so that undergo the really complex embryological changes through egg through to larvae, goes through a pelagic phase before resettling onto the reef to regrow. And so we have to account all of that complex life cycle into the restoration process, which again adds added challenges. So what I'm going to spend the next few minutes is really walking through what does reef restoration involve exploiting that complex life cycle, because this is where it starts to open the opportunity. We've seen a lot of exciting promise in the terrestrial space in terms of robotics and automation on land. Everything gets complicated, as you all know, once you go in the water. We start off in reef restoration in terms of growing coral, okay? So we typically use coral nurseries. These are all sorts of designs, whether you're talking trees on the left-hand side or nursery tables, it doesn't really matter. It's a structure with which to grow coral. This comes with lots of benefits, but also lots of challenges. Typically, we like to employ these because they're extremely low cost. We can deploy them next to the site with which we're restoring, so transport is not necessarily an issue. But we end up with a whole layer of issues. So access is weather dependent. If there's a change in the environment, we might have to raise or lower the nurseries so they can become quite cumbersome and operationally complex. They have a lot of cleaning required to them. I'll show a little bit more about that later on. Trying to keep them clean of fouling and weeds and pests, #1 problem. They have to be monitored. So we increasingly, as we deploy these nurseries at scale, we need automated means of being able to track our various genotypes, phenotypes, and species across really complex landscapes that are dynamic themselves. And actually, we're ultimately restricted in scale for lots and lots of operational reasons to about 100,000 corals per year. Actually, at present, the largest nurseries in the world are about 60,000 corals. At Shisha, we'll be approaching that very quickly, and we'll be aiming for 100,000 per year in the next 2 years. So the alternative is, well, you can switch tack and grow on land. This, of course, comes with lots and lots of benefits as well. It's basically agriculture on steroids in aquarium-based systems. And really, the pros and cons are almost the reverse of when you're in water. You have control over your environmental conditions with which you grow corals. You have access pretty much 24/7, of course, unless you have a cyclone or a hurricane, which is one of the great considerations where we have our nursery facilities, say in Australia, in hurricane corridors. But again, they have cleaning requirements. They have to be monitored. So again, we have some of the parallel challenges that we face in water. They have a high cost to implement and maintain. And typically they're deployed much further from the nursery locations. You've got to start thinking about transportation. You know, corals don't like to be out of water for very long. So how do you actually then get them from this huge potential to grow them in aquarium systems back in the water? Where the aquarium systems are particularly beneficial is we can really take advantage of the sexual reproduction phase and the control over new genotypes, crossing, selective breeding, etc. So what we find is that many practices are actually starting to combine land-based and in-water-based approaches, which then starts to come up with all sorts of operational and workflow challenges, and I'll return to that a little later on. We then come to the process of replanting coral, and this in itself is arguably the largest problem that we face, is reattaching coral to the reef. If you're dealing with adult corals, you can use physical attachment devices, such as those on the left-hand side, or chemical epoxy or cement type approaches in the bottom right-hand side. There's lots and lots of ways you can attach them. Again, they all have pros and cons. The massive con of all of them in many senses is that they need a diver to deploy. So again, being in water is your greatest constraint, your greatest limitation. If you're looking at replanting the larval phases, then we typically use larval seeding units. We settle the larvae in aquarium systems, or some of those aquarium systems can actually be pools on the reef. Onto these structures, you then have to deploy these structures on the reef. You then have to monitor these structures, whether they stay in place, whether they result in viable coral. So we have all sorts of logistical challenges, again, in terms of being able to do this in an automated sense and tracking our success and our effectiveness in the larval phase. The other element of reef restoration itself is not necessarily just replanting coral, it's actually ensuring that we have the right structure in place to put coral. And one of our greatest challenges in reef restoration is that much of our reef degradation that we faced in recent years has basically left us with rubble fields, and these rubble fields need to be stabilized. So we have engineering challenges of how can we stabilize this substrate with the least impact. And these are just some examples here of using, typically using rebar or aluminium structures to stabilize the rubble, and you can reseed coral on these. They're really effective, but again, they're very laborious and time consuming. At the moment, the scale of these is quite restricted. In the Shisha Island context, for example, we actually don't have many rubble fields. We haven't experienced a lot of coral types that have degraded to that extent that result in rubble. But what we do have is we have a lot of empty space. And we know from this site that corals reproduce extremely well and extremely effectively. They don't actually have a lot of places to go and to settle. And there's lots of reasons why that's the case. So being able to augment and introduce structure that coral can survive and thrive on is a key element of this. We actually have almost a vicious cycle of sand producing systems in many of these sites, where in fact some of the weedy corals that grow, that are able to grow in these sites, are not actually reef accreting species. They tend to fragment and just reform sand. And so there's all sorts of designs out there in terms of automation for production and automation of artificial structures. We've heard a lot about monitoring over the past 24 hours as well within this group. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about monitoring, but automating monitoring, again, is one of our biggest challenges. I mentioned this with the larval seeding units as one example, but really anytime we plant a coral, we need to know if it's effective. If it's not effective, we either need to change what we're doing or stop what we're doing. What's the point in restoring if we cannot demonstrate that it's viable and effective? So our biggest challenge really is not only monitoring replanting coral, but of course the environmental context with which that is done. You can see on the right-hand side some of the imaging type facilities that not only we but others use for creating the photomosaics that have actually been presented in several times at this meeting now. This is just one example, taking it to the next phase where we are starting to break some boundaries within this. And actually we heard quite a bit just before coffee about drone-based monitoring terrestrial systems. We are starting to be able to achieve this in shallow-based reef systems. This is a great piece of work that was produced earlier this year, demonstrating that by shallow-based drone monitoring of this reef site in the Caribbean, you can actually track some of the recovery of limited species over time and space. So again, there is technological challenges and solutions that are being met to some extent, but the scale is still limited. And in this case, it was still limited to that less than 1 hectare area that I demonstrated earlier on. And as we said, you've seen this image before about using photomosaics. It's an opportunity for me to address the question of why do we collect photomosaics? Well, it's not just to demonstrate to everyone out there that we're doing work and that we can immerse this as a public-facing product. This is actually a really critical step for us in terms of the restoration planning. If we can visualize the reefscape that we intend to work at, we can then start to create probabilistic intentions. If we change the ecosystem in one way, how might it cause a ripple effect across the entire ecosystem, not only in terms of the ecology and the biology, but in terms of how we fine-tune the environmental conditions and the hydrodynamics. So being able to implement other sources of data into these photomosaics, so beyond the ecology itself, is one of our grand challenges. So what I wanted to do for the next 10 minutes or so, really to close out this, is really start talking about where some of the steps are required or starting to emerge, and really think about where this group is best positioned to leverage what is the opportunity that is right around the corner. So when we think about robotics and automation, our critical part in any of this is maintenance, really securing our investment of all of this time and effort to restore the system. I mentioned cleaning, so being able to have an automated means to clean, whether that's targeted invertebrates that foul our structures or just algae that typically is pretty persistent at some of our sites, is a really critical element of that. The same extends into aquarium systems. They need constant cleaning. For anyone that's owned a home aquarium, you know the effort that's required to keep it algal free. Well, scale that up several orders of magnitude in terms of what's required. Well, really you need automation to be able to do that effectively. What you can see on the right-hand side is another element of maintenance that's been played around with for a while on the Great Barrier Reef. This is what's known as the COT spot. COT stands for crown of thorns starfish. It's a voracious predator of corals on reefs, and when it causes outbreaks, it can decimate entire ecosystems of coral. And we've lost many, many, many hectares of coral on the Great Barrier Reef to COTS. You do find COTS in the Red Sea. And so this was created. I'm not going to tell you what BOT stands for. You can use your imagination for that. So COT spot has been implemented on the Great Barrier Reef to seek and destroy. So that's one example of using technology to do that. It is not in place at scale. And in fact, divers are still used as the heavy lifters to implement this. But it's one example of how maintenance is really critical to safeguard and in effect provide insurance for all of the effort for the efforts on the reef. Handling is one of our biggest challenges as well, as you can imagine. And I mentioned about the need to transport, and typically when we're in water, there's not a huge, we typically can use divers to transport material around. But of course, again, once you start doing this at greater scale, you need automated means to do this. The image on the left-hand side is an example, is the Nemo transport system. It's basically a big inflatable ring. Okay, it's just basically a giant lift bag if you're a diver. But ways of being able to automate that and think about using a more industrial scale of sensing where do these inventories need to be picked up and deployed, and really thinking about how we can better leverage technology that's out there already at warehouse scales for moving material around is really important. Again, agricultural systems are doing this incredibly well. You can see this on the top right-hand side in terms of robots and robotic handling. We saw lots of that before coffee breaks, really exciting. And my mind was just spinning of how can we implement similar types of scenarios into reef systems, and coral restoration will require a lot of lateral thinking to do that, but the principles are effectively the same. If you can automate some of the handling, whether it's pruning to extract material for replanting, whether it's removing dead material, whether it's removing pests, is really, really, excuse the pun, low-hanging fruit, but it's an incredibly important step for us in terms of automating the process and relying less on divers. Monitoring life support is another really critical area of automation within this realm. And we think about a life support system within reef restoration in terms of retaining the environmental conditions. Now, life support systems we typically think about with aquaria systems. How do we keep the lighting or the temperature within the right window for corals to grow effectively? But when I think of life support systems as well on a reef, I also think about the nurseries themselves. Do they need to be raised to capture more light? Do they need to be lowered to resist thermal stress in the upper layers? So there's all sorts of life support system types dynamics we can think in terms of novel engineering solutions, but also how we can automate that through analytics. On the right-hand side is an example of phenotyping and phenomics. We saw, again, lots of this in terms of the agricultural space before coffee this morning. And again, we have exactly the same needs. One of our biggest challenges actually in the coral space is more a science or a research angle, is what is actually the phenotype of interest we're looking to propagate, and that's an ongoing piece of work. But exploiting those phenotypic signatures, embedding them into automation, again, is a fairly easy win at this point in time. How we do that at scale is the challenge to throw to the robotics community. But we can see the need and we can see the opportunity to do that. The bottom right-hand slide there is one example where some restoration trials have been achieved. You can see a single tank here. This is called the CHAMP. It's basically a coral husbandry phenotyping system that's been thought of. It's basically a phenotyping system on a gantry, exactly the same as the top right-hand slide there in agricultural systems. So again, the extension is not too wildly different. It's just thinking, how do you do this in a setting that's based around water? Again, with monitoring and life support, we use biooptics typically in terms of phenotyping as one example, thinking about aquarium systems in the sexual reproduction phase. Corals reproduce once per year, some of them at least anyway, through spawning, and you end up with a soup of lots of larvae of different species. How do you start sorting that to start generating the material and the phenotypes that you want? So thinking about sorting, selective breeding is a really, really important step. So automating that through image recognition, image sorting and sample sorting is again a really, really easy win for us as a community to think about taking this to the next level and a more industrial scale of operating. Monitoring, I'm not going to say too much about monitoring because it's been covered quite heavily over the last couple of days, but we can certainly think about this in the sense that we need robotics to cover the landscape, the ecological landscape, the environmental landscape. We have a big development within our field of really understanding now how we matchmake between different coral species and the environmental conditions. And it's really utilizing that information, combining information sources about the dynamic environments and the species that are either there or not there, are really important for our informed decision making in terms of what we plant and where we plant it. So having systems that can integrate all of that information are becoming very time critical for us, that we don't make mistakes early in this large scale effort. And then I come to planting again. This is our biggest challenge. And I think there's been a few times mentioned perhaps in the past 24 hours about, can we use robots to plant coral? Well, I can tell you from planting coral myself by hand, it is an extremely dexterous process. And that starts to tell us exactly how robotics could be used effectively to replant coral. There's been some efforts. The right-hand side here, this is ReefGen. They have a trial submersible vehicle to replant coral. It's currently restricted to about 4 corals. Okay, think about that. We need to be replanting millions of corals. So thinking about you do this at scale using robotics is still one of our biggest challenges. But it's not to say it's not impossible and cannot be done. The question is whether it's feasible to do it and cost effective to do it with robotics versus human divers or even robotic divers. So again, the challenge is there. If we can solve replanting coral at scale, that's a huge win for us. What you can see in the left-hand side, this is really interesting. This is another bot from the Great Barrier Reef. This was called larval bot. They're not very innovative with their terms for their robotics, I'll say. But this is an example here where you basically have an artificial insemination type approach. You basically harvest all your eggs and sperm when you go through the mass spawning event on the Great Barrier Reef. You basically put it in tubes into your vehicle, and then you can see the little hose coming out of the vehicle there. You squirt it in a targeted manner onto the reef. The challenge there is how do you monitor whether that's effective and successful? We have yet to see any evidence that this type of approach is successful. So again, we have to be mindful when we develop these robotic solutions and automation, how well do we justify the cost-effective feasibility? And I think we have a bit of a mismatch still in terms of what can we do with technology versus what do we really need to do to demonstrate effective yields for restoration. Information extraction and integration. Again, we've had a lot of information about this over the past 24 hours, and I won't say too much about this, but again, this is where our biggest needs are. And just with other fields within the restoration space, whether it's terrestrial or elsewhere, collecting data in many ways is no longer a problem. Certainly it's data volume. How do we best use all of that data volume, bring data streams together? Image processing, image recognition, extracting data from vast swathes of data is now our huge challenge here. So for example, we can collect a 3-dimensional photo mosaic within a dive of a 1/4 hectare site. That is not a problem for us using either diver or diver-assisted vehicles. What is our challenge is being to exploit all of that for all of the complex reef information we use, either to understand reef dynamic changes over time, or to be able to inform us to make strategic decisions about how, when we modify that site. And we have a long laundry list of needs of information that we need from that. The challenge is being able to work with data engineers to be able to extract that information and meet the needs. So this is just one example of really the resolution we're currently at with the photo mosaics themselves. You know, we can collect this, as I said, 1/4 hectare within a single dive, and you can do that right down to a millimeter scale. So we can even track larvae in larval settlement, larval recovery, larval recruitment. So huge potential out there. So what I wanted to close on was really just to say something about the opportunity. So I've said a lot about the problems. I've said a little bit about where some of the tantalizing steps might either be coming from or could come from. We have huge opportunity to exploit this need and this problem. We're currently in the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. It started in 2021, lasts until 2030. So obviously is in place to meet many nations' goals towards 2030 of being much more sustainable. However, we had a new landmark deal that was launched in Montreal at the end of 2022. And that is the biodiversity framework. And that tasks 200 nations with restoring 30 or maintaining 30% of their ecological assets. This also means that we have a huge amount of financial leverage. So I've mentioned CORDAP there in the bottom left-hand side. That's a Saudi funded investment program for research and innovation into the coral reef space. We also have the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, which is a blended finance tool that invests hundreds of millions of dollars into innovation. In fact, they have a call out at the moment for innovations into marine protected areas. So funding is becoming less of a problem over time. It's about putting the right sets of people together to meet some of the challenges and the problems we have. So I urge you to exploit these opportunities. I urge you to have conversations with us. I've been really inspired over the last few days with the last 24 hours of presentations, and hopefully we can use the next 24 hours to come up with some solutions. So with that in mind, I want to say thank you very much. I'm hoping there's time for a question or two, but understand if there isn't, I'll be around and we can take coffee to catch up. So thank you very much for your time.